Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to some of you, and peace out to the rest of you. It is the blackest hearted, blackest minded, blackest man on social media, signing black in and shining again, asking you to hit the share button because the message is more important than the messenger. That being said, the red pill showed me something about colorism, just like colorism wound up leading me to the red pill. You see, any man missing something that is very important to women is bound to have to develop a red pill awareness, and most men are missing something. Now, that depends on if the man is taught to count women as important. I was. Consequently, what that means is that when women were picking other men, saying I was cute, but then acting ambivalent around me, treating me differently than how they treated other men, I had to look and say, well, what's the reason? I had to at least ask myself, what is the reason for it? Did I do this, or is it just them? When that became necessary to do, I was, of course, told that it wasn't happening, that it was the same for everybody. But in fact, it was happening, and it was not the same for everybody. And this is now understood. Now this is known. Everybody in my family knows it. So, as you all know, that story, it led me to the red pill, which led me to SYSBM, Ibmore. Now, having been red pill, I've learned some things about colorism. And one of the ways that I know that colorism does in fact, I'm going to tell you who colorism does in fact affect the most. It affects the lightest of the light-skinned black women. It affects light-skinned black men, period. Especially if they're especially the lightest of them or the ones with thinner hair. And it affects dark-skinned women. The ones that are least negatively affected are darker-skinned men. The irony of it is that in some parts of the country, it still has negative effect on them. Most of the ones who would have been negatively affected by it are still alive. So that's why there's not this understanding among them that it doesn't affect them. However, most of the younger ones are not necessarily affected by it in every region of the country. It's very regional if you're a dark-skinned man. So the point is that there's no demographic of black people that are completely unaffected by it, except the ones that are smack dab in the middle for their region. But they're still affected by other things like featureism. And featureism is not just a preference for the East African traits over West African traits. Notice I said East African, because European traits are just East African traits, that's all. It is not just that, it is also the way that we make jokes about each other's ear size, height, everything. Because we roast each other in general. And colorism is merely one symptom of this greater disease that causes us to not just roast each other as jokes, but to roast each other even in a serious manner. Now, what I've noticed is this. Black people will outgrow stereotyping white people by the time they finish middle school. The stereotypes are jokes, but we by that point we learn you can't say all white people are like that. But we don't really outgrow stereotyping each other based on complexion until maybe the 20s. And lately, what I'm seeing with this new upcoming crop of adults is not even then. Now, we men understand that you cannot paint all complexion, or you cannot paint all women of a particular complexion with one brush. We men understand that. Maybe jokes, but you can't really seriously do it. I'm not so sure that this is happening with sisters in their 20s at this point. I don't know. I mean, with sisters in their 20s now, are they sitting up and saying this? Are sisters in their 20s now understanding that you cannot paint all of them with one brush? In the 30s and 40s, yeah, probably so. But what about the ones in their 20s? You see, the other thing I wanted to point out about this is that there are jokes, and that jokes are fine. They're just jokes. They should be allowed. But then there are the serious beliefs. How did that happen? The jokes of my generation were not kept away from the ears of the children. And now those children are adults, and they believe this stuff because they're relatively young adults. They're in their 20s, and they now believe it. Now they are in their 20s, and they think this stuff is true. Even light-skinned women in their 20s think that light-skinned men are punks and got vaginas. The jokes are one thing. As long as they're just jokes, they will be okay, but we failed to keep them from the ears of kids and from the ears of very immature little girls growing up, and as a result, they were allowed to become adults and keep these ideas. This was our mistake. We're going to have to pay a dear price for it, and we're already paying that price. The other thing I also wanted to point out was that we're not the same as our kidnappers. And so, and when I say we, I'm talking about all of us. We're not the same as them. We don't have it in our nature to hold grudges like that. We're more likely to do that with each other. And we don't have any genocidal instincts. We've never taken a genetic reason to go and wipe an entire group out. We've never taken that mindset. This is something that's always been, it's always been theirs. But remember, I studied history back stateside. I studied and then taught history back stateside before I left. And there's a statement that was recently made on social media. I heard it repeated. The statement is that it was not whites who began white supremacy, but rather it was light-skinned Negroes. And this was made by a black person. There is a truth and a lie to that statement, and I'm going to explain it now. The truth to that statement is that it was not white folk that started it. Europeans' color prejudice is relatively new. Somewhere in the 1600s, you started to see and hear about it. 1700s, it really took off. 1800s, well, you had to have that in order to have the Jim Crow of the post-Reconstruction period going into the Civil Rights era. It wasn't the whites that started it, although they did take it to a new level. However, it wasn't light-skinned black folks running around in Africa saying, "Oh my God, we're better than the rest of these darkies" that started this. That was not the case either. It was not. What it was Aryans, and I don't mean from Europe. Aryans coming out of Eurasia, meaning specifically Persia and Afghanistan. That's where the term came from. Arya and Ariana. And if you notice, Afghanistan's oldest airline used to be called Ariana. It was taken from that. They were the ones that went into what's now India. And they in India started the conquest, and then they started the caste system. As far as we can trace back, they were the ones who began it. These were just light-skinned Negroes. In other words, they were our descendants that moved to another continent, into another climate altogether, adapted to it, and then subsequently when they came across people that had kept more of the phenotype from the tropics, they couldn't tolerate it. And it really developed when the mixing began after the conquest. And they realized that they were vanishing, but the ones they conquered were genetically dominant. And that was when they said, oh, no. We're going to stop this in its tracks. We're going to put everybody into a particular caste based on occupation. But because we're freezing race mixing in its tracks, it's actually going to freeze certain colors into the caste. That didn't work, but that's what they meant to do. And when they called that caste system Varna, they were actually just using the word color. That's all it was. Yes, that was the beginning of white supremacy as far back as historians can trace. Yes, this does precede the Europeans' version. This is not something that Africans started. It's not something Europeans started. It was something some confused mongrel half-breed mutts started, and I'm only calling them that because of what they began. Otherwise, I would have just called them human beings adapted to their climate. These are ideas we need to get rid of. You don't have Africans running around of any shade with a genocidal instinct based on DNA. I think I've said it enough. Thank you for listening. Assalamu alaikum. P.S. I knew I was forgetting something. The main thing that the red pill taught me about colorism, and this is sad that I forgot this because this was the main thing, is that colorism, while being practiced and believed in by all demographics, both genders, is also largely opposed by most of us. However, the continuation of it is not the fault of the men. When I say continuation, I mean from generation to generation. This is the major point I wanted to make about what the red pill taught me about it. It is not passed from generation to generation by adult men. It is passed from generation to generation by mothers, grandmothers, aunts. And it's really bad that we're being blamed for it. That was the major thing, and I'm sorry that I forgot that. That was the major thing that the red pill taught me about colorism. We got a better shot of not having that passed on sometimes outside of our community than in. And that's heartbreaking. I'm not saying that with pride. So, gentlemen, many of you, as you pick your mates or your stargates, are going to have to screen them for colorism. They don't need to make sure you're not colorist. You're going to have to make sure they're not. Not just because of what they prefer, but you got to screen them for whatever it is that they're going to teach their kids. That being said, thanks for listening again. The blackest of the black, sign and black out. Assalamu alaikum.